of ransomware attacks on U.S. hospitals by the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, HSS, and CISA. Now, for today's briefing, I'm going to break this down into a couple of categories. First, I'll discuss the current intelligence we have, what is happening, and how this campaign is unfolding, with a bit of a refresher about the actor campaign and their motivations. Then I'm going to hit briefly on the speculative side of things. I think it's worth discussing that, even though none of that is proven, and discuss some of those theories that are still unproven, but again, worth a discussion. And then we'll discuss recommendations for go forward, some guidance on how to position investments and shore up your defenses. We'll keep that pretty high level because, obviously everybody's different in this, but it's also an opportunity to mention some of the strategies we've seen your peers taking, as Ben Dankers and I have been on pretty much back-to-back calls over the week, to really help people understand, what is an appropriate strategy to deal with this. And of course, the strategy at every different system is a little bit different. So first and foremost, the team here at CynergisTek has been continuing leveraging our intelligence relationships and partnerships to learn as much as we can about this threat, including direct conversations with the FBI, CISA, and the private security companies that have been working on this. Let's start with a little bit of a reminder of who we're dealing with. So the actor, known as UNC-1878, or Wizard Spider, and UNC stands for Unclassified 1878, meaning that they don't have an immediate classification with a nation-state actor. This group is also known as the organization behind Trickbot, and just, again, as a refresher, UNC-1878, or Wizard Spider, that's the group, that's the humans behind this. Trickbot is the malware used to gain a foothold inside the victims. Once they've moved across the organization, elevated their privileges, they often, but don't always, use Ryuk ransomware in an effort to take down the system and demand a ransomware payment. So in public reporting, you're going to see those things get confused all the time, because I don't think people understand the difference sometimes between the actor, the malware, and their ransomware. But that's kind of how that breaks down. Now, also, for those of you that may have heard this before, remember this is a focused attack on healthcare, largely over the past week. At this point, there are about a dozen systems that we know of that are known to be infected with ransomware, and in several cases, I would probably venture to say most cases, their EHR has been impacted, and they're in various stages of kind of crisis response and dealing with that. At this stage, we do know from reliable sources that there are ongoing attempts to target at least 24 additional systems. As there's a good understanding of the infrastructure used by the adversary, any traffic known to be coming or going to this adversary's infrastructure is being blocked. And this level of understanding of the attack infrastructure in the security community is the primary reason why we haven't seen additional victims or additional detonations. I think the last ones we saw were really over the weekend. There are also reports the adversary is leveraging a link to Google Drive in their phishing emails, and that the malware is being deployed from Google Drive. That finding, apparently from the UHS incident, is only being discussed by one security company, and I have not seen it in any way being independently verified. Either way, I don't think it's a material change, but it is an interesting anecdote. Again, the point here is that this attack does continue in its attempts, but it's being blocked because we all have a really solid idea of the infrastructure that's being used by the adversary. And by infrastructure, I mean the domains they're using, hashes of the files that they're using, IP addresses, etc. Now, this should hold until the point at which the adversary changes their infrastructure. And normally the way we see a cyber attack unfold is you see a ramp, you see a crest, and then you see a long tail as that infrastructure starts to be kind of sinkholed by security companies. That's precisely what we're seeing in this case. Obviously, this has a lot more attention than most normal ransomware incidents, but if they continue to follow suit of what we would expect in an ongoing campaign, at some point they pivot infrastructure. And when they pivot infrastructure, then we likely will need to see additional victims before we understand the infrastructure that they pivot to. No telling what timeline that will be on. Could be a few days, a few weeks, a few months. But I do think it's fair to say that it would be reasonable to assume that a future infrastructure pivot would likely occur. So some of you may have heard this from our last call, but I think one of the biggest takeaways about this is intent and motivation. And the intent here is a really interesting point. What we historically would see with ransomware, because remember, ransomware operators are entrepreneurial by nature. It is in their best interest to make money and not to cause mass disruption. It is also in their best interest not to gain the ire of security agencies, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, the broader security community. We really saw them cross the Rubicon with the UHS situation because of the size of it. And although UHS was able to recover fairly quickly, in fact, I would say they probably weren't largely successful in the UHS's case, and I haven't seen any public reporting as to whether UHS paid or not. But, you know, the point is someone knowingly targeted a system with hundreds of hospitals and other facilities with the intention of taking them down a week after a confirmed death due to ransomware in Germany, and knowing that we're in the middle of, you know, a pandemic. We have never seen that type of kinetic attack on U.S. soil before. We've seen plenty of examples of bad guys trying to steal all of our money, stealing all of our intellectual property, you know, stealing military secrets, stealing money, stealing private information, healthcare information. But all of those types of attacks don't have an actual physical impact on people. And what is so notable here is the escalation to an attack which can actually harm people and harm people at significant scale. So that's what's really caused pause in this, because even the bad guys realize you cross over that boundary, there's potentially implications to it. So that's, you know, and that's also a big part of the question here is why have we seen that change in adversarial intent? And we don't know the answer to that. So now let's move into the realm of speculation. That kind of closes out what we know, facts on the ground. Now let's move into the realm of speculation. First and foremost, I should mention, just because we're in the middle of an election that hasn't been decided yet, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this is election related, although the timing does raise some eyebrows. But we haven't seen anything credible of that, and I think everybody in the security community is really trying to downplay any connection to the election so that we can get through that appropriately, but we haven't seen any reason why it would be. This could be retaliatory due to the attempted takedown from Microsoft and allegedly U.S. Cyber Command 2 weeks ago. Now, one of the side issues that's coming out of this attempted takedown, which clearly wasn't successful, is that that takedown took down a lot of the infrastructure that the security community was monitoring to understand these actors and how they move and operate. So, you know, think of it this way. The infrastructure that was available, where there was lots of telemetry, disappeared about 2 weeks ago in that attempted takedown. So it disrupts the adversary, but it also disrupts the good guys that are watching what the adversary is doing. The infrastructure that's understood now is largely understood because of the current victims. And of course, again, the concern is if we see an infrastructure pivot, then we may or may not understand that future infrastructure and have those early warning indicators. In addition to this, another thing in the realm of speculation is the U.S. Treasury Department's guidance focused around anti-money laundering, sanctions, reminding security companies that if they're in the business of help facilitating ransoms, that they fall under Treasury regulations. What does all this mean at the end of the day? Well, it means that paying ransoms in the future could be really difficult. Whether you're an insurance company, a security company, or just, you know, an end company that is looking for a way out of this. And the bad guys realize that as well. So there could be some additional pressure there to move and detonate quickly before things kind of slow down. So let me pause there and let's take some questions, and then Ben Dankers and I will get into some recommendations. But Carrie, you want to discuss how someone asked a question? I think you can *6 your phone.
You should be able to, at the top of the screen, unclick your microphone.
Great. Any questions so far?
This is Chuck Christian. How are you?
Hey, Chuck.
Thanks for putting this on. The question is, I know there's some organizations that were notified by the FBI that there were a list of emails that were of their facility. They're on some list. Do you know where that list exists? And can we assume that if our organizations have not been notified by the FBI, we're not on that target list?
I don't think you can make that assumption. So there are this list, and I've talked with I have talked with some individuals that have been notified. The list initially came from Hold Security. I have talked to Alex Holden at Hold Security. This was a captured list in basically in dark web traffic between the actors discussing potential targets in the healthcare sector. Many people have categorized that information as what I would call kind of, loose intelligence. It likely is just a list that, frankly, somebody probably could have bought somewhere. That being said, what we have seen is the FBI reach out to some individual companies, not necessarily because they were on a list, but because they had known compromised accounts that were involved in this traffic. So think of it the way this works, right, is, step one, bad guy decides, all right, who am I going to target? And comes up with a shopping list, if you will, right? Step two is they then go out into dark web forums or other places to try to buy credentials for their initial attack into one of those systems. I mean, why take the time to try to fish into your account if I can just buy it? And what that usually involves is an individual that, is using the same user ID and password, maybe on their personal account or their shopping account, which was involved in a breach. That is the information we've seen go from the FBI in some notifications. In one in particular, a lot of that information was very dated. That is not uncommon at all. And I think one of the things you have to temper yourself with in this, and let me first kind of preface this by saying, I think what CISA is doing and Chris Krebs at CISA and the FBI are doing here is exceptional, right? They're really trying to get this out. But you also have to understand their hands are very tied in that there may be additional information they have access to, but the sources and methods and how that is collected, they can't reveal. So, you'll oftentimes see them revealing bits and pieces. Sometimes they can reveal data that's a little bit older. But I would not rely on the fact, if you have not been notified, that you're not likely a victim, because at the end of the day, what we know about this actor and how they operate is they're using automated tools. So they're scanning the web. Once they get inside your company, they're scanning the inside of your company, and the likelihood of you becoming a victim is a direct derivative of your security posture, not of whether they like you or not.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? All right, let me go into some recommendations, and I will preface this by saying, look, we at CynergisTek, we're agnostic on a lot of this stuff. Half the things I'm going to walk you through here, we're not in the business of selling. There are some things in here we can do, but this is a list that Ben Dankers and I put together, talking with our partners, our peers, also understanding what your peers are doing in this space, and really trying to get a good view of what is the best way to combat this. Let me also say that, some of the things on here are non-trivial. And I think what you have to go back to on this is, because this marks such an increase in adversarial intent, we have to really think differently about our security posture. Now, I'm going to take you through this at a very high level. We can also get into a lot of detail, and this is mostly what we've been doing over the last week. I would prefer to do that in more private conversations, because the best way to have that dialogue is do a little poking at, what do you have? How extensive is it? What's the brand of tool you're using? And really looking for those gaps. We've now done dozens and dozens of those calls over the last week. So I'm going to keep it at the high level, just so nobody on the call here has got to kind of reveal to everybody else what they're doing. But if you do want kind of the more in-depth walkthrough, that's something that Ben or I or David Finn or Jeremy or one of our folks can get on the phone with you and really walk you through. And we've got a pretty good playbook we're working off of there. So the first thing you've got to realize in this is that an incident or a campaign of this size, interestingly enough, and I'm going to use the analogy here because we're all familiar with it, is very similar to a biologic pandemic, right? So, let me kind of draw the connection there. And if you think about what we're dealing with coronavirus, one of the first things you really need is social distancing. And, at the top of that list, you need to social distance your network. So what does that mean? You don't want your surgical suite on the same network node as the EHR, as an example. In the event that your surgical suite gets impacted with ransomware, you don't want it spreading everywhere else. So just like we see, massive super spreader events in the case of COVID, a lot of what we're dealing with here are networks that aren't segmented. So when the bad guys get into one segment, they're in the whole thing. And I fully realize that network segmentation is a massive undertaking. The good news is the technology there is very good now and allow you to segment off medical devices. Our advice there is get started. I realize that is not something that's going to get done in the next 3 months, but it is also one of those cans that keeps getting kicked down the road, and that's one of the biggest things that would really help with it. So first thing is social distancing for your network. The second thing you've really got to look at in this is the metaphorical equivalent of contact tracing. So just like in a pandemic situation where when there's an outbreak, we want telemetry on that as soon as we can to know who's infected so we can quarantine them, protect everybody else, and address, their infection. We want to do the exact same thing on our network. And the contact tracing mechanism that you would use for this type of cyber attack is endpoint detection and response, EDR, tools like CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, high efficacy tools that sit on the endpoint and give you telemetry. And, the simple question you should ask yourself is, if you look at any of those hashes that were produced, by and released out there on this particular attack, can you identify every single workstation in your environment and whether or not those hashes or those files have been seen? That's pretty much impossible to do without an EDR tool. These tools are commonplace in other industries. They are not typically used in healthcare, or if they are, a lot of people are doing pilots. And, many of the discussions we've been having this week, somebody's doing a pilot with one of these tools, and they're now moving that rapidly into full deployment over the course of the last few days. I can't underscore enough how effective these tools are. They're not cheap. They are relatively easy to deploy, though, and they are also tools that you could get. You can deploy these things at 10, 20,000 workstations a day with pretty high efficacy. So again, the second thing is, in addition to the social distancing of your network, you need contact tracing. The third thing you're going to need in this is the equivalent of a mask. And just like in the case of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and you want to try to prevent, neighbors from infecting each other if they're in close contact, you've got to remember that when the adversary gets their dropper into the individual they've phished, now they're on the inside of your network. They're going to drop in a set of commercial-grade tools to now harvest credentials and elevate their privileges. These tools are unbelievably effective. They can crack a 12-digit password in seconds by brute forcing it. So those tools, you have to defend against that password cracking. And the mask in this case is multi-factor authentication. And what we've learned in talking with many of your peers over the course of the week, and probably many of you, is although a lot of people have been doing, pilots with multi-factor authentication, or they have it deployed. In most cases, it's only deployed on the external connections into the system, not the internal. And where we see people moving fast is to now turn on those same tools internally. There's obviously some concerns about internal disruption there. However, a good multi-factor tool can mitigate that because you don't need to go do the multi-factor challenge. If it's the same workstation with the same user ID in the same location I've seen before, I only need to do that the first time. It's when I see a new location, a new user ID on a new or a new workstation, any of those combinations, I need to do an MFA challenge. So that's the next critical step, is multi-factor authentication. And then kind of lastly in this, the gowns, if you will, in all of this is privileged access management. And you have to protect those admin accounts. This is something that if you haven't done, you want to do tonight. Whether you can lock them down with MFA, making sure that privileged accounts are not being used off of workstations, make sure they're only being used for admin work, being heavily monitored. And that can be done in one of two ways. There are some groups that are saying, hey, let's bring somebody in and do an access audit and look for, maybe there's not tooling in place, but let's at least go through and audit what we have and clean up any open holes. Or go deploy a PAM tool, Privileged Access Management tool. Interestingly enough, there are PAM tools you can also deploy really quickly, but that's kind of the last thing. So, and I use this analog because it actually really works in this case. It's one of these things where, whether we're talking about a hospital or school system or whatever, if you don't have these tools in place with this type of attack coming in, your risk of an infection that gets out of control is very high for all the same reasons that it is in the case of COVID. Now, happy to go into a whole lot of detail below that. Probably better to do some of that detail privately, but figure we at least give you that kind of brief overview. And let me flip this over to Ben if there's anything you want to underscore with that, Ben.
No, Caleb, I think you did a great job covering it. And as you mentioned, if you decide you want to have a more technical conversation as it relates to any one of these items, we're happy to do that more on one-on-one. And in those conversations, right, it's going to be a mix of both the tactical, go and patch this, make this changing in your Active Directory, and strategic findings that kind of Caleb outlined as it relates to things like privileged access management or EDR strategies, microsegmentation, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, well, let me open it up for questions.
I've got a question on multi-factor authentication for you.
Sure.
This is Todd Haverstock from Blessing Health.
Hey, Todd.
If it's if it's going to be putting that in for internal is certainly not going to be quick nor easy from a workflow standpoint for a lot of healthcare organizations. So, would it be wise as kind of to buy down the risk to focus that more on administrative accounts if standard user accounts are, for the most part, not having any admin access, but to focus on IT, shadow IT, and those with elevated rights first, who might be easier to implement that for from a workflow standpoint?
So let me give you two answers to that.
Okay.
First answer is what you suggested is what we've seen many of our clients doing, right? Is saying, okay, let's start there. Let me take that hat off and put on my hat as a security professional for a second, and let me also then kind of add, okay, I got it, but I think the balance you really have to have in this, and man, I really don't want to sound like an alarmist in this. I'm just looking at the likelihood of an impact in this case, because remember, these bad guys are using automated tools. All they got to do is find one or two places where you haven't got that shored up and they're going to strike. So yes, there's an operational impact. I do think that can be mitigated. But I also think as you look at all of this, whether it's an operational impact, whether it's frankly a budget impact, which is probably the bigger issue, what you've got to get the conversation you need to be having with your executives right now is, yes, there's some pain associated with this, whether it's operational or financial. How does that compare to the pain if we get shut down in the middle of this? And I think that's really the dynamic you've got to work through. Far be it from me to describe what the answer is, but I think what you suggested is what I see a lot of people doing.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? And if you're looking to unmute yourself, just look on the screen. You should have a little microphone button there. If you move your mouse around, just click on it, and you can unmute yourself. All right. Well, if there's no additional questions, we'll go ahead and close this down. Again, we are happy to engage with you in a more detailed level. We decided that we probably shouldn't go there on an open call. Not that anybody did anything appropriate, but on the last call, we had a lot of people diving in deep into a lot of the questions in their particular system, and we didn't want to have people doing that in an open call. But happy to dive into a lot of detail with any of you privately, and just let us know if we can help there. One last opportunity if anybody's got a question.
Yes, this is Jeremy.
Hey, Jeremy.
Hi, this is Jeremy from Erickson Living. I just for many on the call, maybe like me, the original calendar appointment did not come with a link. It was flattened. There was no HTML links to it, and I could not find a way to join if there was a digital link. So I believe this was recorded. If this is available afterward, I would love to rewatch if there was anything shared. Thank you.
It is. Yep. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks everyone. Good luck out there. Look, we will continue tracking this. Okay, so now I'm entering into the realm of a guess, right? So this is purely based on nothing. I'm going to guess at this point, and Ben, argue with me if you disagree, but I'm going to guess at this point that this is probably going to slow down for a bit, right? In that these attacks aren't getting through. We may see another victim or two if they're able to get in. The next real question is, when do they pivot infrastructure? And or when does a copycat actor walk through the same door? Now that this kind of threshold has been crossed, I don't have any idea when that could be. Days, weeks, months, but it won't be years. It'll be sooner than that, and that's what I think we've all got to be prepped for. But the good news right now is that although this campaign continues, most of it's being sinkholed at the carrier level. So hopefully no one else is going to drop. All right, thanks everybody.